Chapter 1. The Boarding. The hum of Horizon Airways Flight 217 filled the cabin as passengers shuffled aboard, their voices blending into a soft murmur. The first-class section, with its wide leather seats and crisp, conditioned air, felt like a world apart from the crowded gates of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Businessmen in tailored suits tapped at laptops. A woman in pearls adjusted her designer sunglasses. And somewhere near the front, a minor celebrity scrolled Instagram, oblivious to the boarding chaos. At seat 4A, by the window, sat Jamal Carter, a 14-year-old black boy in a gray hoodie. His backpack tucked under the seat, he gazed out at the tarmac, watching baggage handlers dart between carts, a faint smile tugging at his lips. This was his first time flying alone. Not just that, it was a reward, hard-earned. 3 months ago, Jamal had stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., accepting a trophy for winning the National Youth Science Fair. His project, a solar-powered water purifier, had beaten out hundreds of entries, earning him praise from judges and a first-class ticket to New York, courtesy of his school and a quiet donation from his father, Derek. To Jamal, it wasn't about the luxury. It was proof of what he could do. A moment to sit tall after years of being underestimated. He adjusted his hoodie, the fabric soft from wear, and pulled out his boarding pass to double-check. Jamal Carter. Seat 4A. First class. The ink was crisp, undeniable. He slipped it back into his pocket, letting the hum of the engines settle his nerves. Outside, the sky bruised purple as dusk crept in, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Then came the voice. "Excuse me, young man." It was firm, edged with something Jamal couldn't quite place. He turned to see a flight attendant standing over him, her posture stiff, her uniform pristine. Her name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, Marlene Harris. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she asked, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jamal blinked, his hand instinctively tightening around the armrest. The cabin seemed to hush, and he felt the weight of her gaze, and the unspoken question behind it, settle over him like a shadow. Chapter 2. Rising Tension. Jamal sat up straighter, reaching into his hoodie pocket. "Yes, ma'am," he said, pulling out his boarding pass and holding it up. Seat 4A. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, but his voice stayed steady. Marlene Harris barely glanced at it, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is a first-class seat," she said, her tone clipped, as if that explained everything. "I know," Jamal replied, meeting her eyes. He'd heard that tone before, teachers who assumed he'd copied his homework, store clerks who trailed him down aisles while white kids stuffed candy into their pockets. It wasn't loud or angry, it was quiet, insidious, a doubt that clung like damp air. Marlene's eyes flickered over him, his hoodie, his sneakers, his youth, and something unreadable crossed her face. "Where are your parents?" she asked, folding her arms. "I'm traveling alone," he said, his stomach tightening. He wasn't ashamed of it. His dad had trusted him with this trip, but her question felt like a jab. Like he needed someone to vouch for him. She sighed, her patience visibly thinning. "You see, there must have been a mistake. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers only." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Around them, the cabin grew quieter. The businessman in 3B paused his typing, glancing over. The woman in pearls shifted uncomfortably, her earrings catching the light. A black college student in 5A hesitated, his hand hovering over his phone, then looked away, jaw tight. "But this is my seat," Jamal repeated, gripping the boarding pass tighter. He wasn't being difficult, he had proof. Right there in black and white, but every second made it harder to push back. His ears burned with the silent judgment in the air, the weight of eyes that watched but didn't help. Marlene forced a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "There's been some confusion. You need to take your things and move to economy." Her voice was firm now, an order dressed as a suggestion. Jamal's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to demand she check the system. But the way she loomed over him, authority wrapped in a navy blazer, made his words stick in his throat. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached down for his backpack. His legs felt unsteady as he stood, stepping into the aisle. Marlene didn't offer to help. She simply turned and motioned toward the back of the plane. Right this way. As he walked, he passed row after row of first-class passengers who'd seen it all. Some lowered their eyes. Others shifted in their seats. No one said a word. In economy, he sank into an empty seat, 23C. Narrow and cramped, the air thicker with the scent of coffee and sweat. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, then pulled out his phone. His fingers moved fast. They made me move to the back. Said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket. She didn't believe me. He hit send, the message flying off to his dad. The reply came almost instantly. What do you mean they made you move? Who? Derek's words were short, sharp, not panicked, but focused. Jamal typed back. The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake. Wouldn't listen. A pause. Then. What's the flight number? Jamal's fingers trembled slightly as he sent, Horizon 217, and waited. Another message. Stay where you are. I'll handle it. Jamal exhaled, leaning back. He didn't know exactly what his dad meant, but something in those words told him this wasn't over. Up front, in the galley, Marlene Harris adjusted her uniform with a satisfied air. Another problem solved. Tasha Green, a younger flight attendant with wide eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her bracelet, hesitated as she set down a tray of glasses. She'd seen it all, the sharpness in Marlene's voice, the way she hadn't even checked the system before deciding the boy was out of place. Was there a problem with his ticket? Tasha asked carefully. Marlene scoffed. Please, you saw him. Do you really think he paid for first class? Tasha's stomach twisted. She'd worked dozens of flights, people of all kinds sat up front. From tech bros to retirees. But something in Marlene's tone, the way she said him, made her skin prickle. But you didn't check the system. She pressed, voice low. Marlene waved her off. Trust me, I've been doing this 20 years. I know when someone's in the wrong section. Tasha bit her tongue. She wanted to argue, but Marlene's seniority loomed like a wall. For now, she stayed silent, the unease settling deep. Chapter 3. The Turning Point. Jamal stared out the economy window, the view half blocked by a scuffed wingtip. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't check it yet. His mind drifted back to Atlanta, 6th grade, when Ms. Hargrove had accused him of cheating on a math test because no one gets a perfect score that fast. Or last summer, when a clerk at the corner store shadowed him while white kids laughed and pocketed gum. He'd learned early that proof didn't always matter when people had already made up their minds. Back in Atlanta, Derek Carter sat in his high-rise office, the city sprawling beneath him. A tech entrepreneur who'd built a fortune in renewable energy. He was also a silent investor in Horizon Airways, a detail he rarely mentioned. Even to Jamal, his phone lit up with his son's texts, and his jaw tightened. He dialed a number, his voice calm but edged with steel. This is Derek Carter. I need to speak to the captain of Flight 217. Now. On the plane, the intercom crackled mid-flight. Marlene Harris. Please report to the cockpit immediately. The air shifted. Passengers exchanged glances. It wasn't normal for a flight attendant to be summoned like that during service. Marlene stiffened, smoothing her blazer, and strode forward, her heels clicking against the floor. She stepped into the cockpit, expecting a routine update, but the atmosphere was thick. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled pilot with graying hair, turned to face her. He wasn't alone. On the in-flight video screen sat a man in a sleek office. Hands folded, his expression unreadable. Marlene's breath hitched as the captain spoke. This is Mr. Carter, the owner of a significant stake in Horizon Airways. Do you know who I am? The man on the screen asked. His voice low, deliberate. Marlene swallowed. No, sir. The captain continued, his tone firm. You removed his son from first class without verifying his ticket, without checking the system, without reason. The blood drained from Marlene's face. She opened her mouth to protest, a mistake, a misunderstanding, but the words wouldn't come. Mr. Carter leaned closer to the camera, his eyes piercing. You're going to turn around, walk back to economy, and personally return my son to his seat. A long pause. And when this flight lands, you'll explain yourself to the executive board. The screen went black. Marlene stood frozen. The cockpit suddenly too small, too quiet. For the first time in her 20-year career, she felt something new, panic. She'd always been the one in control. The one who set the rules. But now, those rules had turned against her. She stepped back into the aisle. Her legs unsteady. The passengers didn't notice. Most were dozing or flipping through magazines, but Tasha did. From the galley, she watched Marlene's face, pale and drawn, and felt a flicker of something like justice. She didn't know who Mr. Carter was, but she knew Marlene had crossed a line. In 23C, Jamal's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it. Taken care of. You're going back where you belong. He exhaled. A small weightlifting. Whatever his dad had done. It was working. He leaned back, waiting, his calm exterior hiding the storm of emotions beneath. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about every time he'd been made to feel small. Today, though, the story would end differently. Chapter 4. Climax. Marlene Harris stood at the edge of economy, her throat dry as she scanned the rows. Jamal Carter sat by the window in 23C, his expression calm but unreadable, his backpack resting on the empty seat beside him. She cleared her throat, crouching slightly to meet his level. "Sir," she said, her voice quieter than it had been all flight. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Jamal blinked, tilting his head. A misunderstanding? His tone was even, but the question cut deeper than any shout. "You saw my ticket. You still told me to move." A few passengers exchanged glances. The black college student in 5A, who'd stayed silent earlier, now watched with a faint nod of approval. The woman in pearls whispered to her husband. "She should have checked." Marlene swallowed, her face burning. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she admitted, the words tasting bitter. "I'd like to correct it now. Please come with me." Jamal didn't move right away. He didn't argue or yell, he just watched her, his silence stretching longer than she could bear. Then he reached for his phone, his fingers brushing the screen. A moment later, Marlene's work tablet vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, hands trembling, and read the message forwarded from Horizon's executive office. "Take your time." Make her understand what she did. Her heart pounded. Derek Carter's influence lingered, even from hundreds of miles away. Jamal looked at her again. "I'll go back," he said, his voice steady, "but I want to know why you thought I didn't belong there." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Marlene's mind raced for an answer, procedure, protocol, anything. But the truth sat heavy. She'd seen a black kid in a hoodie and assumed he didn't fit. She opened her mouth, but no excuse came. "I misjudged the situation," she managed, her voice barely audible. Jamal nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement, then stood, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. As he followed her back to first class, the cabin watched, the air thick with unspoken tension. Back in 4A, Jamal settled into his seat, the leather cool against his back. He pulled out his science fair notebook, flipping through sketches of his water purifier, grounding himself in the work that had brought him here. Marlene lingered nearby, her usual authority stripped away. She stole glances at him, his quiet confidence unnerving her more than any outburst could have. In her mind, memories flickered, years of sizing up passengers, enforcing unwritten rules based on snap judgments. She'd never questioned it until now. When the weight of those choices crashed down, Jamal wasn't the one who should be nervous. She was. The plane began its descent into New York, the skyline glinting through the window. For Jamal, it was a return to where he belonged. For Marlene, it was the start of something she couldn't outrun. Chapter 5. Resolution. The landing was smooth, the wheels kissing the tarmac at JFK with barely a jolt. The intercom crackled as passengers unbuckled. "Marlene Harris, please remain on board." Her stomach tightened. She'd known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real. One by one, passengers filed out. Some cast quick glances her way, curious, judgmental. Others walked past without a word. Jamal stood, adjusting his hoodie and slinging his backpack over his shoulder. For the first time, he looked at Marlene, really looked at her. Her eyes darted away, then back, searching for something to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words fragile, almost lost in the cabin's hum. Jamal didn't smile or scowl. He just nodded, an acknowledgement of what had happened, not an absolution, then turned and stepped into the aisle. As he walked off the plane, the college student from 5A caught his eye and gave a small salute. "Good for you, man," he muttered. Jamal dipped his head in thanks. Stepping into the jet bridge, the sterile airport lights a stark contrast to the plane's dim glow. Marlene stayed behind, her legs leaden. A security officer appeared at the door. "Come with me, ma'am," he said, his tone neutral. She followed, each step heavier than the last. She'd walked these halls for years, always in control, but today she was the one being watched. In a conference room, the executive board waited, stone-faced, folders open. They didn't fire her outright. Suspended, pending review, they said, citing protocol violations and unacceptable bias. She nodded mutely, the word bias echoing in her skull. Outside, Jamal stepped into the terminal and pulled out his phone. "Back in my seat, thanks, Dad." Derek's reply buzzed back. "You earned it. Always have." Jamal smiled faintly, the tension easing from his shoulders. He'd faced this before, assumptions, doubts, but today, he'd walked away with his head high. For Marlene, the ground had shifted. She'd spent decades judging others. But today, she'd learned what it felt like to be judged, and found wanting. Chapter 6. Call to Action. The story doesn't end with the flight. It's about what lingers, how one quick judgment can humiliate, strip dignity, and ripple outward. Jamal's quiet strength, Derek's resolve, Marlene's reckoning. It's a reminder. How we treat others, especially when we think no one's watching, matters. What would you have done if you were on that plane? Spoken up? Stayed silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think, hit the like button, share it with someone, and subscribe to Real Life Reflections. Let's get to 10,000 subscribers. Every story has a lesson, and we're here to share them. See you next time.